Hello, thank you for the invitation to share with you some of the thoughts about historical discriminations against Asian Americans in the United States. My name is Hien. I am a professor of sociology and Asian American studies at San Jose State University. So I just want to begin with this idea that for Asian Americans, the first group of Asian immigrants that came to the United States were recruited as workers during the 1840s with sort of the idea that we found gold and that we needed a lot of labor. And as a result of that, there was sort of this idea that they were primarily brought in as workers and not necessarily to become part of the United States. And as you'll see throughout this talk, that one of the consequences of that is the idea that as they were seen as the outsiders and not becoming sort of Americans, they faced a lot of discriminations, right? So there was a lot of laws that passed against them, both in terms of labor, but also in terms of accessing the mines. As the number grew, they faced a lot of discrimination. It culminated with this idea of the 1882 Exclusion Act, whereby it was the first time and only time in American history that a group of people was excluded from entering the United States based on their race. Regardless of that, once the Chinese were excluded, we began to recruit other workers from Asia because we still needed workers, right? So the next group of people that came were people like the Japanese and immigrants who came also as workers. You then also began to have Korean workers who came, and then Filipinos. And all of these groups that I just mentioned came primarily as workers. And one way you can think about this is to think about if we really wanted to allow people to come part of the United States, is that we would not pass laws that would designate them as aliens ineligible for citizenship, which is kind of what happened to all of these groups from China, Japan, Korea, and then the Philippines as well. All this culminated in the 1940s with the Executive Order 9066 that was passed by the federal government, which basically removed 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were U.S. citizens from the West Coast. And again, that came about after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And so one of the interesting questions that you can raise is why is that only Japanese and Japanese Americans were put into concentration camp, right? And part of the argument that we'll make is that they are one of the groups that, again, were seen as assimilable. They were seen as forever foreigners. They were seen as a perpetual foreigners. And all of these sort of negative stereotypes begin to have consequences because they began to be seen as only non-Americans. And then this changed a little bit with the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, whereby we now still needed workers, but we wanted to showcase that we were not as racist or as discriminatory of a country as we were. So we allowed more people from all over the world to come. But we also based it on the needs for American workforce, right? And so the new group that was coming in became much more highly educated. And so this is where you have the difference between those who are highly educated, those who are professionals and so on, and those who were not professionals. So because of that, you begin to see this transition that we're seeing differently. So they went from being unassimilable, the yellow peril, to now being seen as the model minority. And part of it was in response to the civil rights movement, whereby we wanted to showcase the fact that, again, America as a country was no longer racist. And therefore we can see it by allowing people from not just Asia, but from Europe and from other continents to come to the United States. This model minority myth then sort of created this hierarchy, right? Because again, if you are seen as a model minority, what that means is that there's a racial hierarchy that white or European Americans are on top, and then Asian Americans are closest to them because, again, we are the model minority. And then you can line up the other groups below that. You can have African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans underneath that. However, this thing is very fragile in the sense that while we are seen as a model minority, we're also continue to be seen as the forever foreigners, right? So you begin to see this tension that exists between in different groups. One of the contributing factors that continued this was actually the idea of the stereotypes that were created through Hollywood, right? So on one hand, Asian American women are seen as the dragon lady, are seen as exotic doll, to be pampered, to be taken care of, to be seen as very needing of the hero to be rescued. On the other hand, you see Asian American men as being emasculated in the sense that they are only seen as either people who are serving the American society as servants, or they are good at kung fu. So this kind of weird relationship is sort of the way that we try to define both gender and race simultaneously. One of the results of that is that you see the rise of a mail order brides, right, whereby Americans can order their brides literally from places in Asia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and so on and so forth. So what you begin to see is this very interesting, complex dynamic that we see. So on one hand, they are seen as a mulatto minority. On the other hand, they are seen as this yellow peril. And at the same time, they're always blamed for things that go wrong in the United States. So this reflects sort of the more recent things that we've seen in the sense of the escalating in terms of violence with respect to what we've seen in the United States, especially during COVID, right? So it was not surprising, for example, that the former president actually called it the Kung Fu or the Chinese virus. And that sort of invoked a certain sense of discrimination, a certain sense of the old stereotypes that we have of Asian Americans. As a result of that, we've seen in 2020 and 2021, this escalation of tremendous amount of violence toward Asians and Asian Americans, especially in places that has a lot of Asian Americans. So the most probably notorious case is the case in Atlanta, Georgia, whereby 5 Asian American women were killed because this person didn't see them as human beings, but rather saw them as the stereotypes that it was acceptable to inflict harm, and in this case, killed Asian Americans. You have a lot, not just sort of physical violence, but you also have a lot of verbal violence as well, especially toward the less able to defend for themselves. So you see the rise in terms of violence toward the elderly in all of our communities. And so you see all of this as a result of these kind of interesting stereotypes that have been created, this perpetual foreigner image that we have. And then sort of the ways that some groups tend to use Asian Americans as scapegoat, right? So again, they play onto all these stereotypes that we've seen in that. So one of the things that is really disturbing, at least in a personal level, is how easily we go back to stereotypes, right? And that how easily a lot of communities are divided because of the way that we think about the model minority myth. So in the case of Asian Americans, they are seen as having taken jobs away from people. And the most interesting case that is being reviewed by the Supreme Court right now is about affirmative action, right? And so you have these tension between Asian Americans and African Americans and Latinos because there is this zero-sum game that at least being perceived. And this violence, this sort of misperception is continued to be seen throughout our society. And one of the things that we don't see a lot or don't know a lot is that hate crimes actually became a designated result because of the 1982 killing of a young man by the name of Vincent Chin, who was seen as a foreigner and was literally beat up to death. And that galvanized the Asian American community so that now at least there are some opportunities for those of us in this field to respond to the rise of Asian American violence. So that's a quick synopsis of some of the things that we could see. And I'm sure we'll have more opportunities for discussion, and I look forward to that. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to our discussion.